Hi, it's Dennis Daly. I've posted over 100 excerpts from some of my more than 250 American montage shows that I did in the 1980s and 90s while at UPI Radio. Recently, I embarked on a fresh series of shows, and here's the first half of one of my new American Montage interviews. John Walton lives in Southern California with memories of a childhood that included living with one of the great silent film stars. But when he found out later that his dad might have been Al Capone, his focus suddenly became the Roaring Twenties, and now he's a walking time machine. I asked John Walton just how loudly the Roaring Twenties roared.
It was wild Roaring Twenties like you cannot believe, and I do take them back in my time machine to everything as it was, including Al in the Roaring Twenties. He worked with a mob that handled Detroit, and he made an association with them, and they were known as the Purple Gang. They were the worst fellas going. And as a matter of fact, after the association, rather than trying to take over Detroit, he said, hey, I'll work with you, because there were 7 of them, and they were as mean as they came.
If you can't beat them, join them.
And that's exactly what he did. And then what happened is, after the association, because in 1927, he was in a little bit of trouble with the other gangs. They were trying to close in on him in Chicago. So when he made his association with the Purple Gang, then he assigned them hits to the other mob members. And a lot of hits were conducted by the Purple Gang, and Al paid them. As a matter of fact, the Purple Gang had a large part in the St. Valentine's Day Massacre. And that the St. Valentine's Day Massacre is when Al, rather than being a Robin Hood to the general public, because of St. Valentine's Day Massacre, suddenly he became public enemy number 1, and everyone was after him.
Let's talk about that transition. You mentioned he was a Robin Hood. It used to, and still does to some extent, amaze me to see newsreel footage of him prior to when his image changed, running around scot-free with the adulation of the public. It's difficult now for us to understand how Dillinger and many of these people were Bonnie and Clyde.
Yes.
Now, was this because the country was in such bad shape, people envied these people who would go out and flout the law that way? Or, I mean, how did Capone get to be... Okay.
It was prohibition.
Prohibition changed a lot of things.
And what happened, Al said, wait a minute, the public did not like prohibition whatsoever. And he was there furnishing them the good booze, not the bad booze, the good booze, and they loved him for it, because they'd go to the speakeasy, get the good scotch, the good Canadian scotch, and everything else. Hey, that was it, and they loved it, and they loved Al. He was furnished them. Al had a code. If you're his customer, he didn't want to hurt you at all. But when it came to the other mobs that were out after him, that was a whole different story. You're after me, I'll do you first. And with the help of the Purple Gang, that's exactly what happened.
It's interesting, this marriage, if you will, between the Chicago and the Detroit mobs.
Yes.
There must have been a lot of traffic going back and forth between Detroit and Chicago through Michigan and South Bend, Indiana. That must have been quite a crime corridor through there.
It was, because what happened, the Purple Gang was the one got the booze from Canada, right over the river.
Right.
And they brought it to him. And then when they wholesaled it to Al, part of the association, he put his own label on it, and it was a log cabin label. It was Al's personal label, log cabin.
So because of Detroit being just across the river from Windsor,
yes,
it was the entry point.
That's it. That's exactly it. And it was reserved for the Purple Gang, and if you wanted to get booze from Canada over there, you better pay them off as you're bringing it over as a tribute to them, or you could get killed.
Isn't it interesting to think of this all-powerful Al Capone who had to pay tribute to another gang? I mean, this is new information to me.
Well, not really tribute. He just really bought from them as well when he hired them to do his hits. He paid them.
Right. They moved then from becoming his supplier to his henchman in many ways.
In many ways, including the St. Valentine's Day Massacre. Now, prior to that, let's talk about Al for a moment prior to that. He was somewhat of a Robin Hood. It was shared with me with a story where this assistant minister, this was prior to 1929, prior to my being born, this assistant minister from the local diocese went to Al's headquarters in Little Cicero and wanted Al to perhaps help him with his Little League team that he had sponsored. The Little League team had nothing other than bats that were made of 2x4s, balls that were handmade.
It was worse than stickball they were trying to play.
It was. So he went there, and Al's henchmen ran him off. But then they shared with Al what he wanted. 2 weeks later, at the Little League field, there's two great big Packers pull in, loaded with balls, bats, uniforms, everything for that Little League. He even sponsored weddings if somebody come to him or anything, and he was always good for a touch. When he's on the street, somebody come up to him, need some money. Hey, he wouldn't hand them 10; he'd hand them 100. And during 1929, when the stock market crashed, and this is history, he opened up soup kitchens in Chicago. He arranged for clothes from the local clothiers to give to the unfortunate lost all their money in the stock market, jumping out second-story windows, everything else, and he was trying to help them. But because of the St. Valentine's Day Massacre, it didn't help him.
It must have changed his image overnight.
Overnight. He's changed his image from being a Robin Hood to public enemy number one, and that was about it.
You were mentioning getting the good stuff. I have seen enough documentaries to know that not only was there a lot of bad booze out there, people were dying from alcohol poisoning.
Oh, yes. But this is mainly from the other gangs, because they were cutting the booze, they were doing all these different things. They were cutting it and adding stuff to it to make it more tasty.
But Capone believed that if you're going to get booze, it's got to be the good stuff.
He wanted the good stuff, and that's why he had his own label, Log Cabin.
Log Cabin. Log Cabin.
Yeah, and that's also not in the general history books, but that happened.
Now, John, let's talk about your mother, Gladys. I have seen photos of Gladys Walton, who was a ravishingly beautiful woman. And her heyday was in the silent era. How many films did she make altogether?
She made 34 movies for Universal, starred in all of them. She became a star when she was 16. She was very active. She was a champion swimmer, diver.
Well, there's a photo of her on the gymnastic rings.
Oh, yes.
All bent out of shape. It's amazing.
Oh, yes. She even performed in the circus movies on the trapeze.
With no stunt double.
No stunt double.
Yeah. And she lived until 93?
94. She was 90 years old. Now, at the time, she quit the movies shortly after my birth. Her last movie after my birth, after that, The Ape. It was called The Ape. Mm-hmm. And she starred in an additional movie in the early 30s as a dancer in Red Shoes. She was just a dancer. But she pretty well quit. And let me tell you about that. What happened during her relationship with Al, she lived the life of the rich and famous. Here she has all the money she needs, and Al showering her with gifts in the meantime.
She's got a double income.
Oh, God. As a matter of fact, and this is a fact, when Al went to prison, prior to him going to prison, he helped her build a house in the town of Kenilworth. And it's still there. It's a beautiful, beautiful two-story home. And after he went to prison, Then she moved there. And then shortly after I was 7 years old, she moved on back out to Hollywood.
Mm-hmm. We're kind of putting the cart before the horse there.
Yes.
From what you said, I hadn't mentioned the fact that she was a confidant. I'm looking for a gentle word, companion to Capone for what, 10 years?
Somewhat, but what happened in 1929 was I was born. There was the relationship continued until 32 when he went to prison, 22, 32. But the relationship dwindled after the St. Valentine's Day Massacre because Al was busy avoiding the other mobs, the mafia who was after him because of the St. Valentine's Day. The other mobs were after him, had himself put in jail for a year on a phony charge, running from the feds, running from everybody in sight, being declared public enemy number one, and finally they got him, tried him, and he went to prison in 1932.
And that was on tax evasion.
Tax evasion. They got him on tax evasion alone.
So it would have been very difficult then for your mother to have continued any kind of intimate relationship with this man who was basically on the run all the time.
Oh, no. No, he was... Well, she saw him off.
Yes.
But he, 29 to 32, he was busy being tried. He was busy avoiding being captured. Mm-hmm. The whole 9 yards. And they even attribute it to the Purple Gang having a hand in St. Valentine's Day Massacre. And they tried to tie him to that through the Purple Gang, and they did have a hand in it. Mm-hmm. It was his gang and them together that handled the St. Valentine's Day Massacre.
John, how old were you when your mother, the great film star Gladys Walton, began to talk to you about Al? And did you assume at that time he might be your dad?
She told me the story when I was 16 years old, all right? But I took it lightly. The possibility of me being related to a legend, all right? Mm-hmm. So
and that was all she said, a legend?
Yeah.
She didn't mention Mr. Capone. She just said a legend.
She said Capone.
Oh, okay.
She said
all right.
Al.
Okay.
As a matter of fact, it was a well-known fact by the family when she was in Chicago. Al assigned her own bodyguard in Chicago.
Really?
Yes.
That's. I would think that would be one of the biggest compliments you could have would be to to have your own bodyguard assigned to you.
Assigned to by Al.
Yes,
and
absolutely.
He had one arm. He was known as one arm.
Really?
Yeah, he was attacked in the Klondike by a Kodiak bear, disfigured him terribly. And
but still strong enough to be a bodyguard.
Oh, was he ever.
Do you remember this guy?
No. Once again, this is prior to my birth.
Oh, well, then you have no reason to remember this guy.
No, it was shared to me by my mother. Mm-hmm. It was shared to me by my mother.
Did she like to talk about that era?
Only later on when I said, Mother, I want to write your story. My mother was quite the gal. She was a movie star in every way, and completely. She was Al's girlfriend in every way, and she also, by the way, was a typical movie star. Al had his own harem in Chicago, and she understood that. That was fine. Mm-hmm. And she let no grass grow under her feet either.
Well, let's go back to her childhood. Where was your mother from, and how did she get discovered in Hollywood?
Well, this was when she was very young. She was born in Oregon, California, Oregon.
State of Oregon.
The state of Oregon.
Yes.
She's born in Oregon. When she was raised by her mother, what happened is her father was somewhat of a nobleman or something, I don't know what, but he was gypsy. and shortly after my mother's birth, he left, going off wherever.
Right, to prove he was a gypsy.
To prove he was a gypsy.
Right.
And so my mother was raised by her mother and her mother's sister, and they doted on her, and they gave her dancing lessons, singing lessons, everything, ballet lessons. Oh yes, everything. And when she was 16, then they took her. Actually, was 15. They took her to Hollywood. She first starred in the one-reelers, and then at 16, she got a contract with Universal. And then what happened, her first movie made her an instant star because it was the movie where she would actually land on the church roof parachuting from an airplane, and she did it.
Wow.
She did it.
Wow.
And then the next day they set the church afire, and phony, of course, but then have her rescue the fellow who would have towed on her. She's staying in the church, and the town is ready to run her off this is the movie, of course, run her off a tar and feather.
Well, in an era where you had serials such as The Perils of Pauline, and you had so much physicality in the movies, because you had action rather than dialogue, really.
That's right.
Universal must have been thrilled to find not only a woman who was extremely attractive, but comparable to being an Olympic athlete.
Yes. As a matter of fact, the first movie made her an instant star, and she continued on with Universal, and at one time during her career, she had 5 movies in current release. I mean, she made the Universal nothing but money. But then, in the late 20s, they had the morals clause. It was a very difficult morals clause. And they found out that she was Al Capone's girlfriend, and they could not renew her contract. And this is Carl Laemmle. He could not.
Yeah.
He was devastated. Here's a gal making him nothing but money, making Universal, and he cannot renew her contract. Then she went east, and then in the east she was on stage, and she was made about 5 movies in the east.
I really envy you, John, because, I mean, we all have interesting stories to tell about our families. My dad, for example, sold plumbing and heating. My mother's family was very religious, and in spite of that, she taught herself to tell fortunes with playing cards. She was doing a lot of that during World War II in USO shows. But they were both very quiet and had interesting families. But boy, to have a mother who was one of the top stars in the country at one time, and then have that association to Al Capone, you're a rare duck, John. You're lucky.
Well, my family, it gets more interesting. My step-grandfather, Daddy Joe, fought in the trenches in France in World War I. This is where they charge the Frenches, and it's all bayonets.
Yeah, and they're down there in the muck.
Oh, yes.
Rotting, which was
yes.
horrible stories.
Oh, and as they cross the artillery fire, it would go all around. Their bodies would get blown to pieces, and then they charge the trenches, and the Germans, they'd attack them with knives, and then the Germans would come across to there. And
they'd fight for 2 years and gain 3 feet.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
It was really nothing. And then after the war, he came to Hollywood, and then he became a small-time cameraman in Hollywood. And then when my mother met Al on the set of The Untamable, and she became his girlfriend, then also he met my mother's mother, Ida, who was single, and they got married. And then he started working Prohibition with Al, as a hoodlum for Al. And there was a lot of money to be made in it, and he made a lot of money. And he worked the tunnels of Chicago.
Let's talk about that. You mentioned that now, the tunnels of Chicago. Was it essentially an underground city in a way, brought about by Prohibition?
Well,
an escape route?
No.
How would you describe it?
It was a route, 60 miles of underground tunnels that the city of Chicago built. And the reason for that was able to deliver all the supplies to all the restaurants and businesses there, the coal, the supplies.
Without cluttering up the streets downtown with
trucks.
But
it was too cold, too.
Yeah, right, yes, I forgot about that.
So then what happened is when Prohibition came along, then the mobs talked to the city and said, hey, let us use it at night to deliver the booze, and we'll give you a payoff.
The association with the police, for example, that era, it's mind-boggling to realize how many payoffs were going on.
Continually in Chicago. I mean, there was all payoff to all the police. And let's talk about the Untouchables for a moment. That is the biggest joke of the world. And I'm not trying to say bad things about the Untouchables, except Elliot Ness, it so happened, died an alcoholic.
So the autobiography he wrote, upon which we base all this glory, was just, as to use big words, self-aggrandizing puffery.
That's it.
Yes.
Because all he did was bust up the kegs of beer and wine and liquor that the people wanted. He'd go there, bust it up. Hey, you can't have it. And when they'd go into speakeasy, raid a speakeasy, they'd raid it with machine guns and shotguns. And if you're a customer, you better stand still or that's it. We'll shoot you.
So unlike Capone, who, as you say, took care of his customers and looked out for them, Ness was just indiscriminate when he came in.
Yeah, in other words, hey, if you're drinking booze and you're not supposed to, and you better stop or we'll blow you away. You're a customer. We'll blow you away.
Although the Untouchables served Robert Stack well.
Oh, yes.
For a while on television.
But the point is that realistically, let me say this, Al was pretty bad. He was probably the worst godfather of his day when it comes to other hoodlums. He was a terror, okay? But he was, from that standpoint, not a very nice guy. But was Untouchables nice? Hey, they're out to kill you if you're going to drink the booze, and you better stop. We're going to put you in jail. And your customer, his customer, wait, I want to take care of them. I don't want to hurt them.
We may have left a piece of the jigsaw puzzle out. You said that Capone had met your mother while she was working on a movie, The Untamable?
Yes, in 1922.
When did Capone start coming to Hollywood? And in other words,
that's when he came.
Okay.
That's when he came.
And having enough money, he could visit just about any place he wanted to.
Well, and once again, he came out in the train, beautiful train, and it was luxury traveling out to Hollywood or L.A. on the train. And the train would stop at Garnet train station, which was there, the 10 and Indian Canyon.
And this would have been essentially the Palm Springs train station.
That's right.
In that area. I will tell people who are not from the Palm Springs area that the railroad comes out from Los Angeles, but it doesn't come near Palm Springs. And you have to go about 8 or 9 miles north of town, or would have at that time, and that's where the Amtrak station is today. It is way out there. We have no railroad tracks in the city here in Palm Springs.
Well, it's still there. The railroad tracks are still there at Indian Canyon and the 10. The tracks are still there. They're used for freight and everything else. They're still there. They're still there.
But essentially, Palm Springs train station was way out of town. That's the point I'm making.
4 miles.
Well, to me, that's way out of town. When you consider most cities had the train station downtown, Palm Springs was an exception.
Yeah, as well as North Palm Springs, because it's known as North Palm Springs then, rather than Fortress West or Two Bunch Palms. It was as well about 4 miles away. But it was easy ride when Al would come to town, or my mother would come out with the movie stars to enjoy the springs and everything else. And it was a weekend.
So Palm Springs as an escape for Hollywood types goes back to the 20s.
Oh, yes. Including Valentino came out here and owned property in Palm Springs and brought his horses out and used to ride his horses after making Son of the Sheik. He rode his horses out here and owned property in Palm Springs.
The second half of this interview is also posted here on YouTube. I'm Dennis Daly.